I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. The presidency is rooted in the Constitution, but its modern dimensions, created by political necessity, were never imagined by the Founding Fathers. Understanding the presidency is vitally important in the success of this great democracy, and that is what this program is about.
I am Warren Berger, Chairman of the Commission on the Bicentennial of the United States Constitution. It is a rare occasion in history to have 4 living former presidents. It has happened only once before, when Abraham Lincoln took office. Our commission decided to interview our 4 former presidents to record and preserve their views about the office of the presidency and the interaction of the president with the other branches of government, with the people, and with the media. Our interviewer and narrator is the distinguished journalist Hugh Sidey, who began covering presidents during the administration of Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Richard Nixon, the 37th president, born and educated in California, was a member of Congress from that state. He served as vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower and was elected president in 1968. He was the first American president to visit Beijing and Moscow. During his second term, President Nixon became the only chief executive in American history to resign from the presidency. The Constitution tells the President and Congress how they should share power in wartime. Near the end of the Vietnam War, Congress addressed the responsibilities of the executive and legislative branches in the War Powers Act. One of the central issues of the presidency today is the intrusion of Congress into the President's authority. For example, his authority to conduct foreign policy.
Well, there's no question that the Congress has gone too far in eroding the power of the President to conduct foreign policy in the broadest sense. I think the most striking example was the passage of the War Powers Act in 1973 over my veto. That's a complicated act, but summarizing it, it said very simply that a president, whenever he sends American armed forces into a foreign country or foreign territorial waters, must inform the Congress within 48 hours, and that he must withdraw those forces within 60 days unless the Congress declares war or unless the Congress authorizes keeping the forces there. Now, as far as that provision is concerned, it's interesting to note that President Ford, who succeeded me, President Carter, President Reagan, President Bush, have all rejected its application as far as their actions are concerned. As far as my own views are concerned, I believe, as I indicated in my veto message, that the War Powers Act is unconstitutional. But what is even more important, I believe that it is very bad public policy. Let me give you an example. You will remember, because you covered it at the time, the situation with the Yom Kippur War in 1973. This was before this act was passed. At that time, I received a very urgent call from Golda Meir. The war was going against them. The Russians had a huge airlift to the Egyptians, and she said, we have to have more arms please help us or we will not survive. We will be defeated. I ordered the biggest airlift in history. It's even bigger than the Berlin airlift. It was very successful. It righted the balance. Israel survived, and Golda Meir wrote afterwards in her books and in her conversations with me and her public statements that that was what saved the day. What is even more important, it laid the groundwork for peace. Now, had the War Powers Act been in effect at that time, it would have made it enormously difficult, almost impossible for us to go through that very intricate kind of operation. We have to remember this, that when a president sends forces into an area, the purpose sometimes is not to wage war, it's to wage peace. That's why we were sending these forces. And the Congress, therefore, should keep its hands out of that, and the president should be allowed that kind of power.
As he stepped into the presidency, Mr. Nixon inherited a war that had been going on for more than 4 years in Vietnam. The United States military forces there totaled over 500,000. The president's aim was to reduce our presence in Vietnam. But in order to put the brakes on, he felt compelled to intensify the war.
The president just doesn't get up one day and say, look, I'm going to bomb these people. You have to have the very best people you can around you to advise you. I was fortunate in having Henry Kissinger and an excellent staff in the White House. Fortunate also in having excellent people in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in the Defense Department, and in the State Department with whom I could consult. And also consult knowledgeable people in the Congress as well, particularly in the Senate. But once he has consulted all these people, and when he has to make the decision, then he must go into a quiet place and make that decision, and it must be his. I had to make several decisions that were terribly difficult, were very controversial, but I made them only after a great consultation.
What were those decisions?
Well, there were several occasions. One of the most controversial was what was called the secret bombing of Cambodia in 1969. Let's understand what that really was. First, it wasn't secret. I vividly recall a meeting I had with Dick Russell and John Stennis, who were the two most powerful Democrats in the House. I went over the whole situation with them. I pointed out that our military commanders in the field were making the point that we were losing many American lives because the enemy was attacking from Cambodia, which was supposed to be neutral, and then going back across the line. And we couldn't follow up. And so they had strongly urged that we bomb those sanctuaries. So I ordered the bombing, after, of course, consulting also with the Cabinet, with the National Security Council, and with selected members of Congress. It proved to be very effective because as a result of that, we didn't have a Tet Offensive that year.
The Constitution makes the military subordinate to civilians, especially to the president, who is commander-in-chief. At other crucial moments of the war, President Nixon initiated strategic military action, even at the risk of widening the war and of canceling the summit meeting with the Soviet Union.
The second area that was very controversial, as you know, was the so-called incursion or invasion, whatever, of Cambodia in 1970. Why was that done? It was done again because we had these sanctuaries where enemy troops were making hit-and-run attacks on Americans and on our Vietnamese allies, killing them by the thousands, and we did not have the authority, they did not have the authority to go back and to try to eradicate those areas. Under the circumstances, I ordered, again after consultation with all of the top officials in the government and with the Congress and so forth, I ordered the attack. It proved to be very effective. We knocked out 6 of the sanctuaries, and there was no Tet Offensive that year as well.
You had no doubts about your authority to do that?
No, not at all. No, it was during wartime, the commander-in-chief has authority to make decisions of that sort. That's why he's commander-in-chief. I ordered the bombing and mining of Haiphong 3 weeks before the Soviet summit. Many people objected to that because they said the Soviets would cancel the summit. But the North Vietnamese with Soviet tanks had invaded the South, and I thought if I couldn't go to Moscow 3 weeks later when Soviet tanks were rumbling through Saigon, it worked. The summit was not canceled And we earned a little respect by it, as well as the agreements we wanted. Perhaps one of the most difficult decisions was the bombing in December of 1972. We had to resume the bombing by V-52s. The reason was that the North Vietnamese had backed away from the peace agreements that we thought were going to end the war, and that they had made before the elections of 1972. I ordered the bombing. It was enormously effective, and as a result of that, the North Vietnamese came back to the peace table. We negotiated the settlement, which ended the war and ended the American involvement in the war on January the 27th of 1973. Now, all of those decisions were controversial, but all of them I would take again, because my goal at that time was to use force in a way that would end the war.
The United States opening to China was a jewel in President Nixon's crown, in which global strategy, timing, and nuances were all important. As in war, he believed diplomatic strategy must be carried on by the president in secret.
He must not be compelled to inform the Congress on occasions when it's necessary, for example, to engage in secret diplomacy. Let me be very specific on that. Had we had a requirement for informing the Congress without secret diplomacy, we would never have had the opening to China. You were there when we went to Peking. We would have never had the arms control agreement with the Soviet Union, and we would have never had the peace agreement with Vietnam. There are times when it is necessary for a president to have so-called secret negotiations, and in the case of forces, to commit forces without going through all of the legalistic requirements that a Congress would like.
Do you view this as the presidency having taken original power away from the Congress as designated by the Constitution? I mean, has the presidency, in other words, grown stronger? And this is part of the problem.
A case can be made for that, but the reason that is written about a great deal is that the world has changed a great deal since the Constitution was written 200 years ago. Let's take, for example, the provision in the Constitution, which provides first that the Congress shall have the power to declare war. The President shall be the commander-in-chief. Now that was very appropriate in those times, because 200 years ago it was the custom, as you know, for nations before they ever engaged in war to declare war. That is not the case today.
What about covert operations and the use of the CIA in this age? It's become a particularly difficult thing for a president. He's, in many instances, you know, been restricted from fully using the Central Intelligence Agency.
Well, I believe that one of the negative fallouts of the so-called Watergate investigations was, frankly, and I put it in very direct language, the castration of the CIA. We need the CIA not only to gather intelligence, but we need the CIA also to conduct covert operations when we do not want to have public declarations of war or what have you, actions on the part of the United States. I would say further, with regard to the CIA, that as a result of the restrictions that have been placed upon it, we do not have the weapons that we need to have to deal with the kind of a world we live in. Let's face it, those who confront us in various parts of the world have their own CIAs. And for us to go in effect, blind up against others who know everything is not in our interest. But I think that the CIA, instead of being criticized, it ought to be supported, but of course restrained insofar as activities like the very stupid moves which they were even contemplating about assassinating Castro.
In spite of those views from the Oval Office, Mr. Nixon still says he honors the principle of shared powers.
The Constitution is a remarkable document in the sense that it applies so well to conditions that could not have even been considered possible at the time it was written. But in this case, the declaration of war provision is an anachronism. That doesn't mean that the president should willy-nilly go into war without congressional support. I was once a member of the House. I was a member of the Senate. And when you're over there, you look upon the executive with suspicion. You don't want too much power there. There shouldn't be too much power either place. But in the conduct of foreign policy in today's world, it is very important that the president be allowed a great deal of discretion, particularly when it's going to be necessary at times to conduct even secret negotiations to preserve peace and to avoid war.
Let's turn now to this matter of divided government. The framers of the Constitution didn't envision that we would have a president of one party and Congress of another party for as long as we have, anyway. I'm sure they understood it might happen on it. Well, what should be done?
Well, I have ideas as to what should be done, but I don't know how I could bring it off.
Well, tell us your ideas.
I would say this first. Let's look at divided government. What's going to happen for the balance of this century? For the balance of this century, I would predict at the present time you're going to continue to have divided government. I think the Republicans will control the White House and the executive. The Democrats will almost certainly control the House. They will probably control the Senate. And so it's a fact, not a theory that we're confronted with here. We're going to have divided government. Now, divided government is bad in some ways, but not bad in other ways. I'm not one to defend it, particularly if I were president. I'd like to have a Congress that was of my own party. But when you do have divided government, it forces a president to speak to the country and to govern in a way in which he crosses party lines. He doesn't make his appeals on the basis of partisanship, but he tries to reach out and get support from Democrats as well as Republicans, or if he's a Democratic president, from Republicans as well as Democrats. And let me say, some of the great achievements have been made when we had divided government. People forget that the Marshall Plan, the Greek-Turkish aid program, the great containment policies which kept the peace in Europe, that was all passed by a Republican 80th Congress supporting Harry Truman, who was a Democratic president. So on that score, divided government can serve a useful purpose. Let me say, too, that to have a government in which a president has two big majorities in the House and Senate is not healthy. I think it was not a good thing when Johnson had overwhelming majorities in the House and Senate, and some of the worst features of his Great Society programs were passed at that time. They would not have been passed had you had more opposition. I think the one area where divided government is particularly difficult is in the area of the Senate. The president has to have the Senate to confirm his appointments to the Supreme Court, to the regulatory agencies, to the cabinet, etc. He also has to have the Senate to approve treaties. And so it makes it very difficult to deal with the Senate that is of the opposition party.
Would you limit the terms
I would.
of Senate and House?
I would. The founders expected, and it proved that this did not work out in practice, that people would not serve in Congress over extended periods of time, that there would be turnover. And I think it would be healthy in today's world in which events change so much to bring in new generations of leaders. And so in this instance, with the presidency limited to 8 years, I think the House and the Senate should be, the House certainly should be limited to 12 years, the Senate maybe to 18 years at the very most. I think it would be a healthy development. But I don't see the Congress ever passing it because they have a vested interest in the status quo.
The essence of the Constitution is its design of checks and balances, where one branch of government prevents the others from becoming too powerful. In theory, the balance could weigh too heavily on one side because of partisan politics.
You stand and raise your right hand. You swear that the evidence that you shall give to the Senate Select Committee on presidential campaign activities shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
The Watergate inquiry, over which Senator Sam Ervin presided, was an extreme example of the legislative branch checking the executive. Mr. Nixon addresses the question of partisan politics in the inquiry. How much of Watergate came from this divided government we're talking about, in which you have extreme partisanship that comes about naturally when you have houses of Congress in one party and the White House in another?
There was no question but that there were, shall we say, partisan overtones in the Watergate investigations. The committee was loaded, the committees in Congress. It was a Democratic House and of course, a Democratic Senate as well. I would say, however, that there were Republicans as well as Democrats who participated in the investigations and who reached the conclusions that they did. So that I'm not going to say that Watergate would not have happened had it not been partisan. But there's no question that some of the excesses of the investigations in Watergate against people like Maurice Stans and others would not have happened had it not been partisan.
For many years, journalists have found Richard Nixon to be a compelling politician when he was a congressman and when he was an unsuccessful candidate for governor of California.
And as I leave the press, all I can say is this. Just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
Some people accuse the press of viewing this politician less as a news source and more as a target. Let's turn to another source of power in this age, and that's the media. Has it gotten too powerful?
I'd like to be just as objective as possible in talking about the role of the media. It is very important for a president or a cabinet officer or a congressman or a senator to be held accountable, to be kept on his toes. And the media today does that. The media is in an adversarial position with regard to public officials, and that is healthy in its way. On the other hand, we have to realize that a president, and we're referring only to the president at the moment, must not simply do the bidding of the media, because he was elected and they were not. Speaking of the media, too, we have to realize that, and I think this is frankly not a helpful development, and that is that television plays too much of a role today. I was shocked to see a poll a couple of years ago to the effect that 75% of the people polled said they made up their minds with regard to the candidates they were going to support from what they heard on television.
In campaigning, there's been some criticism that television encourages the quick line. You know, read my lips with Mr. Bush, and there have been others down the way, and that they get committed to things that they don't really believe in this way. Is there a distortion that you see in the campaign?
I liked the days in the 50s when the writing press was more dominant, because I could sit down with a good, intelligent writer, political writer, and talk to him on or off the record, and we could have a good dialogue. I would learn from it, and he would learn from it as well. But in television, what matters is some script writer will give you a clever line to say, and you've got to get it across in 10 to 15 or 20 seconds. And that line is all that people are going to remember, rather than your maybe very intelligent discussion for 2 or 3 minutes of a major issue. I mean, for example, we discussed something like the War Powers Act. You can't answer that with a quip. If you do, you're totally irresponsible. And yet television forces candidates to be sometimes certainly simplistic and sometimes even silly, because only by being silly sometimes can you really make the evening news. In a television age, how you look is more important than how you think, more important than what you say. Now, having said that, however, it means that when we select our candidates, we've got to remember that they must learn to use television. If they are unable to communicate on television, a president, for example, isn't going to be able to get support for his programs, and a candidate isn't going to be elected.
Good evening. The television and radio stations of the United States and their affiliated stations...
Television is a two-edged sword for politicians, and Richard Nixon cited instances where it worked against him as well as for him.
The candidates need no introduction. The Republican candidate, Vice President Richard M. Nixon, and the Democratic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy.
Mr. President, there were a lot of people back in 1960 who listened to radio that said you beat John Kennedy in the first debate. The people who watched television because you'd been ill and many things, they said you didn't look as good as he did, and therefore the public ruled that he had won. Are you bitter about that?
No, I'm not bitter about it. That's something that we learned, that the importance of television. And John Kennedy was very good on television. He made a very good appearance on television. But I must say that I have had my moments on television too. I saved my political career by going on television in the famous Fun speech back in 1952.
Oh, the Checkers speech.
The Checkers speech, so-called.
Not 1 cent of the $18,000 or any other money of that type ever went to me for my personal use.
In 1969, I made a speech to the nation, the so-called silent majority speech, which kept support for the Vietnam War until we were able to end it on a peaceful basis. So you can learn to use television.
What would you do looking back now as far as press conferences, speeches? What would you change perhaps over what you did when you were president?
Well, when I was president, I didn't have as many press conferences as I should have had because I can handle a press conference fairly well because I spend a lot of time preparing for press conferences. I don't do anything off the top of my head when I can avoid it. But during a war, it's very difficult to have a press conference. You simply can't be candid. And of course, during the so-called Watergate period, it was very difficult to have a press conference. But had I survived, I would have had far more press conferences. I would have had them on television whenever possible, because I'd rather have my views go directly to the people where they can hear me saying it, rather than having it filtered through anchormen or, frankly, writing press who give their views as to what I said.
Mm-hmm. What about the single-issue press conference, where you call in reporters with more frequency, dwell on one issue that perhaps you've been working on at that time? Does that have a place in the future, perhaps?
I like it very much. I think there's a tendency in the press conference today to move from one issue to another. They do allow a follow-up question, but one isn't enough sometimes. Sometimes you have to have 2 or 3. I think a single-issue press conference would be more informative. And you see, the purpose of the press conference should be, and the purpose of a television appearance should be, 1, to inform the public, 2, to educate, and third, of course, to win support for policies.
Some scholars have suggested that adversarial relationship that you talked about had actually become destructive in some instances.
Well, let me be quite candid on that. Members of the press, whether the writing press or the television press, don't win prizes by programs or by articles or by books which are supportive or positive about the people they're writing about. I mean, you win prizes by being against rather than be for.
Well, is that good?
It's not good. It's not good. I think a lot of the responsibility there lies with the editors rather than with the reporters. If the editors would be a little bit more responsible, maybe we would get more honest and more objective reporting. I don't believe, incidentally, that you should have a cozy relationship between a president or a congressman and a reporter. It should be arm's length. It should be adversarial, because otherwise you're just going to have people that are going to pander to you. But on the other hand, it shouldn't be so adversarial that the president or the congressman and so forth is always on guard and figures, well, they're out to get me, and so I'm going to therefore not tell them what I really think.
In a world as complicated, difficult, and dangerous as we've got, should a president have some power to control the media? Should there be any restraint, in other words, on this huge thing called the media?
There probably should be, but I wouldn't be for it. I think once you start down that road, it's a very dangerous road. As irresponsible as the press is at times, and I believe it is, and the media is at times, it's far better not to have that kind of control.
A president has a number of tools to use in domestic affairs, some granted by the Constitution, others implied. There are those who favor additional limits, for example, prohibiting a budget that is not balanced.
I am opposed to a constitutional amendment which would require a balanced budget. I think it would be a mistake, and incidentally, the very fact that we have had armed action in the Persian Gulf, the fact that we're in a recession demonstrates why that is a bad idea. When war comes, or when a recession comes, it's going to be necessary sometimes to have unbalanced budgets. We have to understand that. So I'm opposed to that. That is too rigid. On the other hand, the line item veto is a good idea. let me tell you, I'm sure, like other presidents, I have at times had to hold my nose to sign a piece of legislation which was needed to carry out my own program, which was, I thought, in the best interest of the country, but which had attached to it pork barrel items that various congressmen or senators had attached. And I had to sign it because otherwise I couldn't get what was needed. Now, let me say that a line item veto would mean that the president could strike out some of these irresponsible, ludicrous provisions. Where the economy is concerned, it's been my experience that the less the federal government fiddles with or interferes with the economy, the better that it operates. Now let's go back to what I did. And I recall so well, and you will recall it too, in 1971, August of 1971, I imposed wage and price controls. Now, I didn't do that because I wanted them. I did it because we had inflation then. Incidentally, it was 5%, and everybody thought that was very, very high. But we had inflation, and we were coming out of a recession. But the Congress was going to pass a wage and price control bill, and I had to, frankly, preempt it and pass one that was, ask them for one that I thought was at least less detrimental. Now, that decision in August of 1971 was very popular politically. It, however, was wrong from the standpoint of the economy, it turns out to be. Wage and price controls, I felt, were wrong before I had to, because of congressional pressure, to impose them, and I think it's wrong in the future. I don't think a president ought to have that much control over the economy. As far as the president is concerned, he does have this control, as you know. He has control over the economy because he submits a budget. He can submit requests for taxes, which the Congress has to approve. He appoints the regulatory bodies. And one other appointment area which is very important is the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve can probably have more effect on an economy than any other institution in government. There are those who think that the Federal Reserve should be moved under the Treasury Department. I disagree with that. The Federal Reserve should be independent, as it is today. Independent because if you have it under the Treasury Department, it means you give too much control to the executive over the economy. And then when mistakes are made, they're very, very big ones. I want to have any controls over the economy spread out as much as possible so that when mistakes are made, they won't have as bad an impact.
Mr. President, let's turn to another area of a great deal of discussion these days. Would campaign spending reform help diversify the Congress and really prevent some of those kind of entrenched power areas or people?
There's no question that as far as spending is concerned, that it is totally out of control. A congressman has to spend over 50% of his time attending fundraising functions. And that was not the case when Jack Kennedy and I were freshman congressmen back in 1947 in the 80th Congress. We were bright-eyed and we were going to remake the world, and we had plenty of time to think about such great issues as the Marshall Plan and the Greek-Turkish loan and so forth. The congressman today has got to spend so much time buttering up the contributors that he doesn't have the time that he should have to spend on affairs of state. One reform that might work is to provide free television time. Now, that's television networks aren't going to like that, the business sides and the rest, but that is the custom, as you know, in many foreign countries, and I think it ought to be considered now. That at least levels the playing field. The other area, however, which is even more important, is to cut the perks. The perquisites that congressmen have, they're huge staffs that they have. That gives them an advantage, a huge advantage over anybody who's trying to run to unseat them. In fact, the Congress today is many times simply ends up in an organization for the preservation of incumbency. And that is not a healthy thing.
President Nixon had ample opportunities to exercise his constitutional authority to reshape the Supreme Court. He made 4 appointments approved by the Senate, that of the Chief Justice, Warren Burger, and Associate Justices Harry Blackmun, Lewis Powell, William Rehnquist. However, the Senate rejected two, Clement Haynsworth and G. Harold Carswell. Mr. President, let's turn to the Supreme Court. You've named 4 justices. You had 2 turned down. What's happened there? Has it gone too far in partisan politics?
Well, incidentally, it's not new. I had 2 titanic debates, as you know, with the Senate over 2 of my appointments, one of which was a poor appointment, the other which was a very good one. But let me give you a little background here. When I was attending law school 55 years ago, I remember that the 2 justices of the Supreme Court who impressed me the most were Brandeis and Holmes. They were called the great dissenters. Incidentally, Holmes was famous for writing the shortest opinions and Brandeis for writing the longest opinions, but they were both great justices. At the time, I was shocked to find that Brandeis had had a very difficult time being confirmed. He was without question qualified, but the American Bar Association didn't approve him because many thought of anti-Semitic views of whoever happened to be the leaders of the American Bar Association at that time. But what a loss to the country if Brandeis had not been approved. Clement Haynsworth, who recently died, would have made a great justice. He lost because of a phony ethical charge that some of those who made it later agreed was phony. But the reason he lost was because he was conservative, an honest conservative. Not a racist, but just a conservative. And that was a loss. If the president sends to the Senate for confirmation a judge who is qualified and approved by his peers, the American Bar Association, for example, then I think the Senate should confirm that individual and not put up these arguments that they're against him for reasons that really aren't the real ones. The real ones being that they are looking at his views rather than his qualifications.
Mr. President, what were your measures of men, women to bring into the government, cabinet level, agency heads and that? What did you look for?
Well, I looked first for intelligent brains. I looked also for what I call heart, and I looked also for guts. Let me explain that. In an organization, you need people who have brains, heart, and guts. And perhaps the most important is the last. Now, let me explain what I mean. If you have somebody that's just intelligent, that isn't enough. That he's going to approach, he or she, problems too coldly. Cold intelligence is not what I want to find. I want somebody who has heart, too, who, in addition to being very intelligent, has a feeling for people, knows how to treat people and treats them well. And by guts, I mean you have to have somebody who, when the going gets really rough, that he or she will not jump ship. They will stand with the man. Whether it's, particularly when he has to, he, the president, or she, whoever it happens to be, has to take a position which is unpopular. It is so easy these days and so tempting when the polls show that a particular measure is unpopular for people to desert or to, in effect, as I say, jump ship. And whoever is in the presidency, for example, he's got to have around him not a group of people that are just loyal and always say what he wants to say. I want them to tell him what he needs to hear as well as what he wants to hear. But he must have people who will recognize that it is a very difficult position, and while he wants their best judgment, he also deserves their support if the going gets rough and if he has to overrule what they may happen to advise.
Outnumbering by far his political appointees were the career government employees, and Mr. Nixon, like other presidents, faced what seemed to be an immovable object, the vast entrenched bureaucracy.
It's one of the most difficult responsibilities a president or a cabinet officer or a government official has, because too many bureaucrats think that they should make the decisions, and too many of them get too big for their britches. In order to get the best out of them. It is very important that you consult with them, but you must also keep them in line. And they must understand that after they have given their best advice and the decision is made, then all debate stops. That's true of a cabinet officer, it's true of a bureaucrat, it's true of anybody else, and that they should support it or resign.
Could you see some reforms that would make our system a little more like the parliamentary system, where, for instance, you have a shadow cabinet, you have people in place who are experienced? Would that be wise?
I like the idea of a shadow cabinet, but here you've got the Congress to deal with. They're very jealous of their prerogatives, the minority in the Congress. The difficulty with the parliamentary system, though, is this. It doesn't apply in the United States because, as you know, a British cabinet is made up of individuals who have been elected to Parliament. They have their own constituencies. Therefore, they are part of the elected members of the government, and consequently must be consulted that way. None of the cabinet officers in a president's cabinet is elected. They depend only on him for their position. And that's why cabinet government will work in Britain. It would not work here.
What are the ingredients, the principal ingredients of leadership that you think a president ought to possess?
Well, among the principal ingredients are frankly that to recognize that a president is elected to lead and not to follow. I do not believe in consensus government. Consensus government means the lowest common denominator. I don't believe, for example, a president should have a cabinet around him, take a vote of the cabinet, and then go one way or another. Second, I do not believe that a president should follow the polls. This obsession with polls is ridiculous. If you follow the polls, that again is the lowest common denominator. A great president is one who, rather than following popular opinion, changes it. Rather than following the polls, changes the polls. It is very easy for a president, for example, to do what is popular. But the great decisions that most presidents have been made have been those when they have moved against what seemed to be popular, and by their persuasion and by their actions have made those particular programs popular. And I think that's the major ingredient of leadership, to really lead and not to follow. Running for president is a great ordeal. There's no question about that. But on the other hand, how an individual campaigns is a test of whether he ought to be president, how he handles his staff, how he handles pressure and crises during a campaign, how he is able to communicate, whether or not he's able to win people to his point of view. As you look at a presidential candidate during a campaign, you can make a decision as to whether or not he would be a good leader in the event he were elected president. So therefore, while I think campaigns are too strenuous today, I wouldn't change it, because you've got to put through your candidates through the fire in order for them to develop the steel to be an effective leader of the most important and the strongest nation in the world.
When his administration was cut short by the aftermath of Watergate, President Nixon had much remaining on his foreign and domestic agendas. I'm assuming that Watergate and your resignation probably was your greatest disappointment, but let's set that aside. What would have been, in terms of policy, foreign or domestic, your greatest disappointment that you didn't get it done?
Well, I think if I had been able to survive in office, I had some plans to put Latin America at the top of my priority list, and the Mideast. Those were the two areas that I thought those were my next objectives. I was unable to carry them out. I also had plans to, because I've been interested in the Third World, as you know, from having traveled there so much, to try to develop an effective program dealing with the new countries in Africa. The fact that I was unable to carry through on those foreign policy initiatives was a disappointment. And in the area of what I call welfare reform, I think had I survived, I would have been able to have made some progress in having a better system, because the present system is still a terrible boondoggle. And we can say all we want about the progress that has been made, the fact that Americans are doing better than they used to, that we're better off than people in other countries. But what is happening in our cities today, the permanent underclass is something that has to be dealt with. And if I had survived, I think I might have been able to have made some progress in that area.
What was your most gratifying achievement in your time in office?
Well, in the field of foreign policy, most would say that the opening to China was the major achievement, because it's something that would not have happened unless I had been president. I was the one that could do it, and I did do it. And the world would be very different, and potentially, looking to the next century, when China will be a major nuclear power, much more dangerous if we hadn't had that opening. I think ending the war in Vietnam was an achievement. I think the arms control agreements we negotiated with the Soviet Union was an achievement. What we did, for example, to end the Yom Kippur War was an achievement. That's in the foreign policy area. In the field of domestic policy, I would hope that historically it may be said that one of our major achievements was the cancer initiative. Progress has been made on that. I feel very strongly on that because of our own family. So many people have been involved in that dread disease. And I would hope that, for example, that in the years ahead there will be some progress in that area.
Most of Richard Nixon's adult life has been involved in major league politics. Here is his advice to young people preparing for a career in politics, including the presidency.
First, I would probably limit television viewing to 1 hour a day. I would read for 5 or 6 hours that they normally spend now looking at the tube. I mean, television does not educate. Television sometimes informs, but the way that to develop your mind, you must read, you must think, and so forth. So I wouldn't advise him, for example, to take a lot of courses in political science. I didn't have a course in political science. We didn't teach it at Whittier College where I was. Now, maybe if I had had one, I might not have even lost when I ran for governor. But on the other hand, generally speaking, political science teachers don't realize that politics is not a science, it's an art. And I would say in preparing for public office, to run for public office, the most important thing first is to read, to develop the mind so that you are able to tackle the issues effectively from a broad background. The other point that I would make is this. Don't depend on speechwriters to tell you what to say. Don't look at the polls to find out what you should say, but sit down and think it through. The difficulty today, too many congressmen, too many senators, rather than think the problem through, they have good speechwriters who can probably write better than they can. They have perhaps good researchers who can probably study it through better than they can. But they are elected to do the thinking themselves. And I would like to see more of our candidates and more of our elected officials to do their own thinking rather than depend upon a lot of unelected people to tell them what to think and what to say.
How is your personal life affected by being president?
The personal life of a president is certainly it's probably shortened a bit, although some seem to thrive on it. I think where the presidency does have an adverse effect is on a family. It's very difficult to raise children in a normal way in the spotlight. Now, this is true not only of presidents, it's true of cabinet officers, it's true of justices of the Supreme Court, it's true of celebrities generally. And you will see so often the children of celebrities, they don't get the attention that they should have. And consequently, they have problems. As I look back, people say, well, what was one of your major legacies or major achievements? And I think it's the family. Mrs. Nixon was an outstanding first lady, and she went through a great deal, as we all did, but the fact that she was able to survive it in a couple of strokes and is still very active and strong today is a great tribute to her inner strength. But also our two daughters, Tricia and Julie, wasn't an easy time. The demonstrations during the war were not pleasant. The demonstrations during the Watergate period, the resignation, which they all opposed, was certainly not pleasant. It was a great ordeal. The fact that both survived that and they have grown up to be, I still think of them as young, but we'll say they're young, although they're in their early 40s, to be such outstanding young ladies, I think is a great tribute to them and a great tribute to their mother, because I can't take much responsibility for that. It's very difficult for children to grow up in the White House and to lead a very normal life.
Difficult indeed, not only for children, but for all of those who must dwell in the fishbowl of the White House. But the adventure has never lacked volunteers.